Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's great to be here. And it's great to be talking to you on the cusp of a brand new year. It's been a difficult year, as you all know better than anyone. Difficult economy, difficult for businesses, difficult for the clients you've been working with, and probably difficult for you. But the good news, I think, is that we're actually moving through this. And one of the ways to kind of think about how we're moving through this is that we're kind of at the beginning of a period, of essentially a transformational period, both in this country and around the world. And a lot of what we saw in the kind of financial crash and the slowdown of the global economy, or the crash of the global economy, is more like signs, symptoms of essentially a deeper, more fundamental restructuring that's going on, and that's going to play out for about the next 10 or 20 years. And that's what I want to really talk to you about today, is to understand the bigger picture, to understand the kind of long-term trends that are going on here, and to give you a better kind of strategic kind of vantage point on what's really going to happen next. Now, the way to understand this is that periodically the world, and most of the people here are Americans, but I'm going to take this a little bit more from a global perspective, but periodically, if you thought of it from American terms, there's been periods in American history or world history where you actually get such fundamental kind of forces for change that it prompts a very, very explosive period of innovation, essentially, that lasts about 10 or 20 years, where you essentially reinvent systems and actually that those systems then carry on for the long term. Now, these periods essentially are prompted, but the closer way to think of it is two fundamental things. One, you have deep structural changes to the economy or society. You know, we've seen it like going from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, or moving from rural living to urban living, that kind of fundamental reworking of what happens. Or what happens is you come up against a series of challenges that the old systems had no way to understand how to deal with. You know, the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, certain things that our country and the world has had to face at other junctures. And then what happens is, because of this breakdown of the current systems, you watch this explosion of innovation, not just at government, but through the society in large, institutions, business, innovation, all kinds of different innovation that lasts about 10 or 20 years, and then the new system essentially gets set up that works for the long haul. Again, a great example is coming out of the Great Depression, World War II, we essentially built the post-war system that essentially, with the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, the basic general way that we ran the global economy, and that's the system that we're still working with today. And so now that system's kind of breaking down. Now we're watching another kind of explosion of innovation, and I think this is kind of the way to think about what's going on today. Now, so the way to understand what's the fundamental thing that's going on today? Well, at one level, we're watching tectonic technology shifts. I mean, literally, the level of computerization, how those have started to now bit through every aspect of life and the economy, and also the kind of our telecommunications evolving. Think of it as the internet just getting to the point now where it's really starting to disrupt on a world historical kind of scale. The second thing that's happening is partly because of these technological drivers, but also because of the increasing interconnection of the world, we're essentially entering a new phase, I think, where you have to really be thinking almost beyond what we have been calling globalization. It's essentially the global reworking, the fundamental reorganization of the planet around global everything. And I think if people actually look back in 50 or 100 years' time or 200 years' time, they'll think, what the world did in the early part of the 21st century essentially is it went global. It got organized on a global planetary basis. I really think that's the fundamental restructuring that's going on today. At the same time, those kind of unprecedented challenges are coming up against us, things that we really haven't had to deal with. Climate change. There clearly is a climate change thing going on. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But there's a series, essentially, of 21st century challenges. There's a little push of our... But many of these challenges, because of this globalization particularly, we just don't know how to deal with. Global terrorism we're trying to figure out. Mass migration because of that. We're having to shift to new energies. There's all kind of things that are more domestic kind of oriented, like we got this baby boom retirement. What's going to happen with that? It's just breaking our old systems of kind of Social Security and old systems. They're just not capable of the 21st century demands. Anyhow, across the board, we're getting this. And this also works on a business sense. All this disruption at an economic and social level is also filtering through to basically changing the way we do business. And so whatever you think about it, whether you like change or not, we've got the good fortune, or we are in the position that we are living in this time of transition. We're living in a time of transition that fundamentally is going from a kind of world organized around national borders and national kind of ways of thinking about things to a much more interconnected global world. We're also moving from a world that essentially, and this is a longer term play across this century, we're moving from a world that's based on, let's say, carbon energy sources to essentially one of more clean energy sources. Even if, not even driven by climate change reasons, we just know there's only so much oil and there's only so much, that is in the ground, about 30 years, they think, at most, maybe squeeze a little bit further. And so in this century, regardless of how urgently you're pressed by climate change, we're going to make this transition. It's going to be a very fundamental one that we're going to have to go through. And ultimately, we're going from a planet that's got 6 billion, close to 9 billion people is going to be by the middle of the century, going from some kind of system that doesn't seem sustainable to one that's got to be more sustainable. That's a transition we're going through. And the kind of larger way to just to kind of think about it is we're essentially going from a 20th century way of doing things across the board into a much more 21st century way of doing things. And so what I'm going to do today is start to kind of wrap our hands around this kind of situation and give you essentially a look at 6, think of them as sub-transformations, in and of themselves, still very big things happening, but essentially that are really give you a more tangible way to understand the seismic or the monumental kind of shift that we're going through here. And what I want to do is I want to basically talk about technology, which the underlying driver of this, and give you some numbers and some understanding of really the forward motion that even though we think of our computerized, high-tech, interconnected internet society here as kind of what it's all about, we haven't really seen anything yet, and most of the world is barely just starting to experience this thing. So a lot of the implications of that are actually still ahead of us. I'm going to talk a little bit about this kind of the economics of this, how we're actually creating this kind of global economy that actually has a lot of capacity for a lot of long-term growth still going forward. Despite our kind of shakiness the last couple of years, all the fundamentals are there to pick up growth. Ultimately, I do want to talk about this shift to clean energies, which I think is going to be a driver in any way, big new kind of frame that a lot of businesses are going to need to be focusing on. I'm going to also shift on another one that's very concrete and you can see very closely, is essentially the collapse of old media and the rise of the new. And that's a very dramatic example of how we're watching this system change happen in a very concrete set of industries, the media industries. I'm going to talk a little bit about demographics, particularly this next generation, the millennial generation, the younger generation that's going to populate this world in the next 50 years here, and the ones that you're going to have to tune into as employees and consumers from now on. And ultimately, I want to end here with something that's more pertains to your field of strategy consulting and things, because I think there's actually a new way we're going to start solving problems involving a lot larger numbers of people involved in the process than we have ever had before, partly from this technology. Now, it's a lot to cover. We're not going to basically go in depth in every one there, but we are going to basically give you enough of connecting the dots on things that you probably have heard about or seen about. Some of you might know a lot about it, but I think the overarching feeling of this presentation is to just give you a sense of the transformational kind of the transformation we're really within and how profoundly this is going to affect how you do business in the next 20 years here, or even 5, 10, 20 years. Now, let's start back with the fundamentals. The digital revolution, as he mentioned, I was actually at the original Wired magazine in the early 90s where we were explaining the web to people and explaining what email and various things was even at some level. It's just, remember that. It was only within about 15 years ago people didn't even know what was going on in this kind of space and how this has changed so quickly. Now, the fundamental logic that a lot of you people might know this, or some of you might know this, but it's worth reminding yourself, even if you know this, is that there's essentially a core dynamic in the computer industry that is still playing out right now, which is that every 18 months, engineers are able to get twice as many integrated circuits on a chip, and that essentially doubles the power, boosts essentially the power, shrinks the size, and drops the price. It's called Moore's Law in the kind of parlance of the Valley, and actually outside in economic circles. Now, the one thing is just to remember what happens with doubling. And when doubling starts, that dynamic is, interesting enough. This is what was happening in the early days of computer chips. They're getting a little bit more power, little bit more power. Oh, it's starting to kick in. Oh my gosh, it's getting bigger. Ooh, they're getting more powerful. Ooh, the next power thing goes up. You double again, it goes up 2 stories. Then it goes up 4 stories. Then you're up. Then you start to get as high as this building. And then the next doubling goes twice the building. That's what doubling does. And that's what's happening to computer chips. And that's why these things are so disruptive. So what's happened is, in the late 70s, some of you might remember this, 1 megahertz in an old Apple computer, 1 megahertz, that's the basic unit of power, would cost $5,000 in today's terms. A few years ago, basically a Dell, you could get 2 gigahertz, which is essentially 2,000 megahertz for $1,000, which means essentially in real person's language, computers are 10,000 times more powerful, or you could say 10,000 times cheaper than they were just 20 years ago, or a little bit over 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Now, any industry with that dynamic is going to just pulverize anything around it, and that's what's basically happening with computers. Now, by the way, this has got another 10 years to play out before they think they're hitting actually fundamental ways that they can't shrink them any further. But still, incredible power is coming, which is why, essentially, you can get what people used to think is the power of a mainframe is now sitting in every iPhone. I mean, this is a huge thing, and it's getting in the hands of everybody around the planet. I'm going to talk to you about the numbers of dispersion of that later. The flip side is we know the internet's a big deal. But you got to understand the network effect, which is at the core of the internet. Which is the network effect is essentially taking that same doubling phenomena and applying it to like connecting people up. So essentially you get exponential growth happening as you start to connect people up through telecommunications networks or the internet. So for example, if one guy invites 2 people, and those 2 people invite 2 more people, and those people invite 2 more people, you're starting to get exponential growth going on here. And this just keeps going, so pretty soon you've got that gets so wide, that bottom row, that you're blasted through the walls here, that you're blasting, and it's just huge numbers of people are getting connected together. This is why Facebook has 350 million people on it right now. We're going to show you those numbers in a minute here. But this is essentially the network effect that's going through. Now, what that means, essentially, is you get these powerful interconnections when that kind of growth goes. So for example, here's an example. When email started, we were 300,000 emails would be sent in the early days of, again, when most people here probably barely knew about email. Today, this is a logarithmic chart. This isn't even exactly today, but the last time I did this chart, 183 billion emails are sent every day. Now, a lot of that's spam, and you got to make sure, but the point is there's only 6 billion people on the planet. So that's the kind of the network effect, a phenomenon of that. And a more practical phenomenon is this is why Google works, because it's interconnecting all those like nodes in a very super fast way, so you can ask any question in the world and boom, pops up. If you told someone 50 years ago that you could ask any question in the world and you get all the world's information in a second, they'd think that's magic. And it's, any 5-year-old in the country does it today. Again, very, very powerful things that are happening in the tech world. Now, I'm going to shift to economics. Because everyone's all moping around, oh my God, this global economy, what happened? Is it over? Are we ever going to get growth back? Think about that dynamic I just put to you in technology. That thing ain't stopping. That thing hasn't even slowed a beat in terms of the adoption rate, in terms of how these things are getting absorbed into every country, every nook, every place. Those trends are not going. Similarly, the interconnection of the planet through more and more kind of travel, through more and more trade connections, all this, it's not slowing a bit either. And that essentially, at a fundamental level, are the 2 fundamental drivers of the long-term growth that we've been experiencing the last 25 years. And essentially, it's going to continue, I would say, pretty soon here now, too, picking up. Now, the way to kind of understand long booms is don't think of the specific recession as, don't look close at, the quarterly results. Pull back, and you look at the long-term kind of growth patterns. And essentially, the way to think about that is our era, you could say, from about 1980 to kind of this next decade here, is very similar. There's a lot of similarities to what happened in the post-World War II boom. And people are like, oh my God, it's so different. In some ways it's so different, in some ways it isn't. There was 2 fundamental things that happened in the post-World War II boom, which is worth reminding ourselves. Is what happened at the end of the war is essentially you had a ton of new technologies that came out of the war effort. Literally atomic energy, mainframe computers, commercial aircraft, all kinds of stuff came out of this stuff that essentially came out. And the second thing is you had half the world, the free world, got interconnected in a much more tightly interconnected international economy. Those two trends, essentially, when you really talk about it, is what essentially drove the American boom of the 50s. We all look back at, oh my God, the 50s, what a great time. Everyone was, all the boats were rising. And ultimately, by the 60s, Japan, Europe, everybody was on their feet, and we had a boom going through the 60s. And ultimately, though, growth was going so fast that we ended up with getting choked off, our growth, with the oil crisis of the 70s, among other things. But the point is, huge long-term growth through that era. In many respects, we're still in essentially a very fundamentally similar thing now. We forget about this, but the Cold War ended, and when the Cold War ended, two fundamental things happened. You essentially got a wave of new technologies, the internet being one of them, was devised initially as a way to communicate in nuclear war. Computer chips were designed for guided missiles. That's the first application of computer chips. All this stuff came into the mainstream economy. The second thing is we got not just half the world, the free world, we got the entire world now interconnected in the same global economy. That, I would argue, those two drivers is what the 90s boom was about, because America was the first to jump on that and basically take care of it. That was what's behind the China-India boom of the last kind of decade, where they finally got with their coming out of their communist systems and slow social systems, kind of got into the same thing. And although we're in this disruptive period now, there's a sense that, in fact, those long-term trends could continue here now. Now, to give you a little more sense of how that works, because people think, well, yeah, is that really how, but what about this recession? This is a bad recession. If you look at the growth of the American economy from the crash of 29 to actually the just recent time, I didn't get the latest figures in here, but this is totally understand, the point is made just by the data we have here, is essentially there's one pretty much uninterrupted growth in the economy, in the fundamental growth of the GDP of the economy. Now, the early days when we thought, these are recessions. We used to get hammered with recessions. This is the great deep one, obviously, after the Great Depression. But even in the heyday of the 50s, we used to get hammered all the time with recessions. They even had them again in the great 60s, 70s. 70s wasn't the greatest, but we still were getting recessions. These were the last two recessions we had before this deep one in our era. The point is, though, coming off these recessions, the long-term trends really didn't slow down. Slight pauses, but basically, these things essentially are corrections of the economy that the fundamentals, if they're still driving it, can pick up. And there's a good case this can be done now. The other side of it is, don't think just American economy. This is the growth of the global economy since the post-war period. Well, actually, the whole century. But once you start seeing the pickup from the 50s, look at how the growth just goes whoosh. To by the end of the century, we had $50 trillion economy. Now that trajectory, in fact, is still going. And China and those are accelerating even faster now. So the overall growth of the global economy is huge and going faster. In fact, this is the 4% growth rate. This is China's growth rate from the 60s, when under communism, they basically didn't have an economy. But ultimately in 80, when Deng Xiaoping, basically that's where the growth starts up there, 1980, Deng Xiaoping kind of opens up the Chinese economy, and then it starts picking up, the juggernaut. And because of that, they have high growth rates because they're starting from nothing. Well, China, as we well know, is now $2.2 trillion economy, and we're about a $14 trillion economy. They're on their way, and they are growing gangbusters. And here's what I want to lay out here, is just to give you a sense, because I know you're thinking a lot about China. These are playing out relatively conservative numbers, not my numbers, but Goldman Sachs numbers, of where this goes towards 2050. And a lot of people are doing this, and it's largely kind of consistent with other folks. So take the United States. Whoop. We got to get here. That's the United States growth rate from 2000 basically to 2050. Very healthy, very good. We are still a player in any kind of scenario. That's China. They eclipse us at about 2045. Some people think it's actually going to become quicker. It does depend a little bit on how we each perform coming up here. But they are definitely on a trajectory there. This is India coming right after that. Again, getting into the game where they'll be close to where we are. And this one, the next one, I don't know if you can see it, that's Japan. Essentially flatlining. And ultimately under that, that's Germany. Now Germany, it's a little not fair because Germany is really part of the European Union. But the point is, let's look closely at the 2050 look. That's the global economy of the 2050. The two powers of the 20th century, Japan and Germany, next to the United States, are insignificant. They aren't even players. Who are the two? China and India. And the United States. That's the future of the global economy. Now, there's also Indonesia, and there's all kinds of Brazil, and there's a bunch of ways to also look at these other folks. But that's the fundamental way is we're in a big shift in how the economy works. Now, the second way we're shifting, because I'm going to shift now quickly just to keep all these different balls in the air to kind of see how, oh, okay, that's interesting. But now let's move to the clean economy. And I know that different people have personal different ideas of how urgent this is or not urgent this is. I would just say I'm going to lay out a few numbers for you here, and I'm actually going to make a case that you should really be open to how this is going to be a big driver of the global economy coming up in the next 5 to 10 years with increasing urgency. And here's just some numbers. Now, I know people in the back might have a hard time doing this chart. This is actually charts developed with a guy named Saul Griffith, who I'm working with now in my new company, Next Agenda. Anyhow, he's a scientist, MacArthur Fellow, and gets one of those Genius Awards. So he did a lot of the kind of work here, so I'm not going to take total credit for this. But anyhow, this is essentially CO2 concentrations for the last 1,000 years. The baseline has been, this is through ice cores that can do this. That last bit is the increase in CO2 going on since the Industrial Revolution, basically. Particularly that red version there is what's happened in the 20th century. This is really not a good trend. This is also the last 25 years average temperature rises around the planet. Red being hot, and at the furthest hotness is 1 degree rise in temperature, and the blue being cooling. Very uniform across the planet. This is clear. A lot of scientists are getting to the point where, in fact, it's going faster than they thought. Now, it's becoming an issue, and I don't want to get deep into the politics of how important that issue is here, but in terms of the politics of it. But just let's think through where we are and where we would have to get if this becomes a more pressing issue, which I would argue it is. One is this is the energy production of the planet right now. And this is gas, natural gas, that's coal, oil, plants. We still burn a lot of plants, particularly the third world. And these are the kind of renewables, this little sliver here. Basically, we're on a carbon-based energy system. The world uses about 18 terawatts. That's the highest unit of energy, terawatts a year. That's what we need to continue going. This is how we use it, meaning agriculture uses a big chunk, electricity for all our homes. This is driving, this blue here. This is, anyhow, heating, cooling. There's a bunch of ways that does this. But this is, so you could become more efficient by lowering that, or you could shift the fundamental energy sources to actually deal with this problem. This, by the way, is energy use from the 70s. This is the United States portion of global energy consumption. And this is China, the red, and then orange is India. So we are still the lion's share, but China's coming up close. But the world as a whole is eating a lot more energy. And this is like a trend that doesn't seem to be slowing down. This is the United States use of energy by since through the 20th century by source. So coal was the big one back in the old days, still sizable. Then you watch natural gas. This is the big one of oil, petroleum. Again, renewables, very small sliver of this, including nuclear up there. Nuclear being essentially a clean technology because it doesn't have any carbon footprint. Clean in terms of this argument, I'm talking about climate change. Anyhow, that's our current footprint. And this is how we use it. Again, blues being carbon-based ones, transportation being all oil, electricity there. Anyhow, you can start to see it. Basically, we're on this carbon situation. Now, even if you're in the oil industry, over the course of the century, we're going to have to get off oil and we're going to have to move off of carbon. But if you want to move faster, which a lot of people are saying, that's going to be a huge shift. And so what we have to do somehow in this century, sooner rather than later, a lot would argue, is we got to basically get onto some kind of renewable systems, and these are the 4 that you can do. And so we have to somehow go to get that 18 terawatts of demand. We could probably bring the demand down to about 16 terawatts. You could probably live with about 2 to 3 terawatts of fossil fuel because it's just never going to totally get off it. But we would have to, and we have existing renewable sources, but we would basically have to build close to 12 terawatts of clean energy sources. Now, this is a totally solvable problem. The engineering, the science, the technology is there for the fundamentally rebuild of this, but it is a huge job. Now, from a business point of view, businesses that are doing that, huge growth. And so, and anyone who kind of starts to get more efficient or kind of make their kind of business more sustainable, huge kind of incentives to do that. It's going to come up here. And so theoretically, it's doable to by 2030, watching much bigger segments of our energy sources coming from different kinds of energy sources. Nuclear, like I say, is one that almost everyone's agreeing has to be pushed further, and I shouldn't say everyone agreeing. It's clearly understood by the science and engineering. We have to basically build that out because it's much better on climate. Anyhow, right around the board, you can build out wind, you can build out all this stuff. It's going to be a huge growth potential industry. Now, I would just kind of wind that up by saying in the United States, this is our current energy for just the electric grid. Basically, it's carbon-based. And this is potentially what you'd have to shift to. Anything to do that kind of shift, particularly efficiency there, huge shift going on. Now, will it happen? Is the political will there? Is that transition going to happen now? Is it take 30, 30, 40 years? Who knows? Point is, this is going to happen this century. You should get your head wrapped around it somehow. And ultimately, think of it as a pro-business thing, because ultimately, you're going to have to rework to fundamentally take this seriously. All these different systems, including becoming much more efficient buildings, all kinds of different things coming in here. And we can talk about that later if we want to. But anyhow, there's a lot of fundamental growth left in that transformation. Now, I want to shift here more closer to home rather than speculation to give you a sense of a industry that you all just experienced, and you may know something about professionally as well, but media. Because everyone here grew up with the old media, and everyone is probably familiar and getting more exposed and more familiar with the new media. This transformation is an extraordinary transformation. This thing has happened so fast in historical terms, and is so profound that it's worth just looking at some of the numbers of this. Essentially, what has driven this is essentially the internet. I mean, on a basic level, everyone gets that. But here's how it worked. Essentially, the internet was only introduced in, let's say, the early 90s here. And so you have basically had two booms in the internet. You had the low bandwidth internet boom, which is the 90s, and you had the high bandwidth internet boom, which is essentially the richer media, the higher bandwidth media. That's the way to understand what's happened. The first crew, any media company, old media company that had to do with text and photo, which could go over the low bandwidth, got hit. Not fundamentally, but they got hit early. The ones that didn't, you couldn't move television, you couldn't move video across the internet in the first wave. Those are only starting to get hit now. YouTube wasn't invented till 2005. It didn't become a company until 2005, for example. Anyhow, but in short order, all those industries now are getting hit. The bigger and bigger the bandwidth comes. And so to the point now, in 2 decades essentially, you've watched the impact now of the internet, and it's now only going to go up, right? Now, what that means in terms of the old media is every one of these media industries of the old media was essentially a top-down broadcast medium. Newspapers, the editors and the journalists put it out. No one could say anything about it. Same thing with television. You had a little broadcast crew, boom, everyone could watch the TV, couldn't do anything else. Every one of those things is completely knocked on their butt right now. And the ones that really were hit early were those written media ones are the most severely traumatized. And I'll give you one example, just to drive home the numbers on this. This is the circulation of newspapers. 1984 was the peak circulation in the United States. It's 63 million circulation. This is just, again, a 2000, this has even gotten worse since I made this slide, but I use these numbers. They had basically a 50% drop in circulation. Well, any business that loses 50% of their customers is going to be traumatized. And in fact, what has happened in the last 2 years is every single newspaper in the United States has essentially is on the block and is barely surviving. And a lot of them are going under. One newspaper a week is going under in the United States right now. And they're not all the biggest ones, although some of them, Boston Globe, San Francisco Chronicle, they're about to go under. This is like a traumatized industry, believe me. The second thing, though, is it's now hitting these higher bandwidth ones. And so this is just one good example of the slide of broadcast television. It used to be in the early 80s, wasn't that long ago, 90% primetime viewership you'd have in the big broadcast crew. Now you basically get less than 30%. Now, a lot of that's cable and everything picking it up, but it's now also going to the internet and all this other kind of things that are happening. Anyhow, that is not an industry you want to basically be driving, which is why NBC's frantically trying to take Leno and putting him here and pulling him out and putting him there. It's like, that's the economics of it. Now, new media, on the other hand, is exploding, and everyone knows that's true, but just look at the numbers here. And this will drive home how dramatic this is happening. So for example, let's take YouTube. YouTube, like I said, didn't exist until 2005. And in that first year, December 2005 till September 2006 there, they were sending out 100 million video streams a day. 100 million video streams a day in the first year of its existence. Now, put it in context, Seinfeld in the 90s would hit about 30 million homes. Now, it's not exactly the same thing, but this is 100 million video streams. They're not exactly one for one, but the point is, just give you a sense of the numbers. And now YouTube is, they won't confirm this, but they're probably closer to 200 million video streams a day, and they are only one site among many in video streaming. So essentially, you are watching explosive numbers in this thing. Now, the flip side is I mentioned this thing about Facebook. Facebook, just to look at these numbers, if Facebook were a nation, it would be the third biggest nation in the world. It's bigger than the United States. And every single person on it is college educated or at least in high school and a smart person. There's no peasants, rural peasants, and there's like in China and India. This is essentially an amazing group of people, and it's growing. And the other thing is they're adding 700,000 new people a day was what was happening in the, I don't know what the latest numbers are, but this is happening in the summer and into the fall. So those numbers keep going up. I've changed this slide. It says 350 million users. In the last 6 months, I've had to change that slide about 3 times because it's just gone from, it was 200, and then it was, oh my God, it's 250. And anyhow, that's the network effect as people get connected up. That's huge difference in social media. Actually, 2/3 are outside the United States for your Go Global theme. And here, phone, again to your Go Global theme, we've now got 1.3 billion people on the planet online. Actually, it's probably a little bit, it's probably edged up a little bit since I made this slide. We have now gotten, this is an astounding fact, basically 4 billion people on the planet have cell phones. Most people in this room probably didn't have a cell phone 10 years ago, or maybe, let's think 10 years ago. Maybe not 10 years ago, but say certainly 15 years ago. You might have had a company phone that was like that or something. But now, like every peasant in in kind of Zimbabwe, well, not Zimbabwe. That's the one place that probably didn't have it. But anyhow, it's an amazing fact. And this is why Twitter and all these other kind of phone apps are just exploding, because the amount of people that are able to use this thing is huge. So actually, by the way, 1.3 billion of those online are basically coming through handlines. I mean, they might also, like me, can get online on a computer and online on, with your phone. But that's an astounding number. And so what's basically going to happen is all that 4 billion is going to be online in very short order. So we are going to have this fully interconnected planet, even if a guy makes $5 a day or something like that in some of these courses. Now, to keep the crazy pace of this up and to keep you stimulated for your next couple of days here, I'm going to move to yet another topic here, but I think this is really important. This is talking about this next generation in America. An amazing generation, a very amazing generation, the millennial generation. Think of them essentially as the folks in their 20s and teens, and a lot of you might even have kids at that age. First of all, they're the biggest generation in American history, bigger than the baby boomers. And this is the way, if you think about it here, this is what essentially demographers use this way. This is called an age pyramid, or used to be called an age pyramid, where essentially men are the blue and women are the red, and you start with little kids, 0 to 4 on the bottom, and you get old people at the top. And the reason they were pyramids is societies used to be very orderly about this. You'd have a lot of babies, and people would die off in very ordered fashion, and you'd have like 5 old people at the very top, right? That was until the baby boomers came around and said, no way. The boomers are essentially stretching that. Oh, plus medical advances and all the different health kind of things that have happened. And so what's happened now is the population of America in 2015, which is very close here, 5 years out, essentially you're going to have all boomers will be 50 or older, and now push it up to 70. But the key thing is this bulge. That is the millennial generation. In some respects, it is the kids of the boomers, but it's also immigrants, because there's been a huge surge of immigrants, and we're going to lay out that in a second here too. This generation is essentially where the boomers were like in the early 70s. And think about how many ways American society changed through the boomers, going through every life stage. This is really what's happening to this generation. And as a business, they're your employees, they're your consumers, they're buying their first homes, their cars. They are the people you have to basically totally get. And by that time, they'll all be adults, 18 and over. So right now, they're basically that age. Technically, they are 31, the front lip. There's a little debate on where you start or end, so that's it. They also, this has a little bit, that's 50 million of them were eligible to vote, which is one of the reasons they were like behind this Obama thing, and we won't go into the politics of it, but in fact, there's more of them every year, and so there's a lot of kind of interest in like what is the impact politically of these folks over time. But also, it's part of a global boom. Half the planet now is under age 30, and actually the median age is falling. So you think about going global, you got to deal with a young future. The world are there millennials. That's the world right now, or going to be. Now, everyone thinks, well, young people, I know what young people was. I was a young person. Not true. Every young generation has its own personality. This is a Time magazine cover for the Gen X, which I'm sure there's a lot of Gen X people here. They had one kind of, more brooding kind of, look at the black leather thing. And this is a Newsweek cover a couple years ago. This is the millennials. Hugging, boys and girls, colorful, very different vibe. And that's just kind of a fun way to play with it. But there's a lot of things about this generation that are different. And I'll just mention 5 because we don't have enough time. I do a whole talk on just this millennial generation, frankly. For one, they are the most diverse generation in American history. 40% of them are from minority groups. It's something, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second here. They're the most endowed, educational levels, without question. More educated, more resources, more things went into this generation of kids than any other previous generation, even though we wring our hands about education and stuff. Higher education levels. They are the most global by far. 20%, I was talking about this at my lunch table, 20% of all college kids now go abroad for a significant chunk of either year abroad, semester abroad, or summer abroad. 20%. When I was a kid, it's like barely anybody went, Huge kind of exposure. And some of the elite colleges, it's more like 50 and 60% of these kids are doing it. Just expected you go abroad. They're extremely civic-minded. They're really can-do kind of folks. This is partly why they got all involved in politics and Obama and all that stuff. Very optimistic crew. This is a really different generation. It's one that you got to wrap your head around differently. The other thing is they're born into this new world of this new tools. These are the workers that get this new media and get some of the technology implications. I'm going to give it to you in a second here. Now, the other thing I mentioned to you was it's the most diverse generation in American history. This is happening across the whole country, but because immigrants are normally younger, it's reflected in this generation. But these trends you should also know. Any business in the United States has got to really think through the implications of this. This is essentially the United States population from 1980 to 2050, mid-century. These are based on Census Bureau numbers. This is just basic, normal immigration. This isn't illegal immigration or anything like that. And this is basically, the bottom line here is the Latino population played out till 1950. And essentially, by 2050, 30% of the country will be Hispanic origins. Just like, if this would have been, same thing would have happened in the 20th century, you would have said, the immigration, the Italians and the Irish in the early part of the late 19th century and the early 20th century played out by the middle of the century. John F. Kennedy was president, Frank Sinatra was the heartthrob. That kind of thing is happening to essentially Latino culture and Latino kind of roots, essentially, in this country. Or in many ways, there's a lot of parallels. But anyhow, you got to wrap your head around that. Now, the flip side is, it's not just Latin America. Essentially, in 1960, actually 64, we made a very conscious decision to change our immigration law away from preferring Europeans to essentially opening to the rest of the world. And so what happens from that point on, essentially, is the growth here. This is the percentage of the population of minorities, the bottom one going up, and the top one, since it's a percentage, is the white population coming down. Now, so right today, that's where the United States stands in terms of its basic kind of balance of white to minority population. This is the projection, again, based on Census Bureau understanding, that essentially where the United States will be. Basically, it'll be there in 2050. That is where California is right now, essentially. And I think Texas is close to that. So it's not really that different in some respects. You can see it happening in different states. But essentially that's, now anyone doing business in the United States has to also understand that dynamic going on here. Now, the final thing here is, this is the current situation in the United States. Already, you can see the percentages of folks, even in these border states, well over 30% of the population's Latino, and also into the heartland. Which brings me to my last section here, which is more about, trying to just gauge here, I think something that's really applicable to your business. Because the final transformation I want to talk about is the most nascent and the most least understood. It's one that my current company actually I've been working on for the last 18 months. And I'm going to give you some early thoughts on this actually here because I think it's important to what you folks are doing. I think there is going to be a transformation in how we solve all these problems, the method, the process, the approach to solving problems that will essentially be up to the scale of all these challenges we face as a country, as a world, and all these pressing, crazy challenges like climate change. And it kind of goes back to the power of these technologies. And there's three fundamental things that information technology does that allows you to do and apply to almost anything. One is it allows you to scale. And I already went over in the early part of this talk how that actually works. But you can do much larger numbers of people can do things through technology than you can ever possibly think of in physical spaces. The second thing, which is partly related to this, is you have the ability to because of those large numbers, you can actually parallel process and do a lot of things, break problems down and solve them and bring them back together. And the way this works, and this is a server farm. So when you guys basically do, let's say, a Google search, your query is essentially broken into subqueries and is distributed through a network of smaller computers which do that little piece of it, reassemble the answers, and pop it back to you. It happens in a split second because it's all connected with fiber optics. But that essentially is distributed problem solving is essentially at the core of what essentially our current kind of internet actually works like. Very different, by the way, than supercomputers were. Supercomputers were just building bigger and bigger and bigger brains, and someone said, oh, what if we took little brains and distributed the ideas? And that ended up being scalable and faster. Anyhow, that's how the computers work. So there is a way to start thinking if you start to scale a lot more people together, you could start parallel processing on a lot of these issues essentially that I was talking about, or in a kind of business sense, all the different kind of pressing issues that are going to happen to various companies as this world changes this fast. The third thing is the classic thing about technology collapses space, where you can finally do things. You don't need them in the same room. We don't all have to be here, although there is a lot to be said about what happens in face-to-face meetings. You can start to essentially do this paradigm shift, is go from always having people together physically to starting to leverage huge numbers of people all over the world. So if you start to think about, those are three now new capabilities of technology that is now able to be applied to a lot of things, but to problem solving, you can start to basically think about things differently. Now, one other development, this isn't Leyden's idle musing on this. I want to mention what's happening in the Silicon Valley right now is essentially companies applying themselves to that problem, largely talking about how do we start to get a lot more very sophisticated people working in very, very nuanced and complicated ways. That essentially is what's behind this Google Wave. Now, some of you might have heard about Google Wave, and without getting too into it here, in tech circles, this is kind of the biggest thing going on right now. It hasn't been fully released. It's been released to a developer crew, of which my company is one of them, and we've been working with it. But essentially, it's very indicative of a next generation of tools that is trying to figure out much more sophisticated collaboration amongst high-capacity individuals, not just commenting and rating a few things, but essentially working on common documents, really having a lot of sophisticated interaction, nuanced interaction. This is essentially where I make the analogy to, like, if you were talking about social networking in Facebook 5-6 years ago, people wouldn't really got what you're talking about. But in fact, we now look back on it and say, oh, I get how that works. There's a similar kind of stew happening now in this web collaboration space that ultimately we're going to look back on and say, I get it now. The other sign of it, well, one of the things is these are platforms This Google Wave is a platform like the iPhone app. So you have a whole collection of developers, including my company, figuring out new ways to actually figure out how do you collaborate online using super different apps. Oh, I'll do an app that does whiteboards. I'll do an app that votes. I'll do an app that ranks. So you're getting a platform that's getting much more sophisticated, much more nuanced kind of ways to do collaboration happening on this Google Wave, and will continue to happen. And the third thing that's happening is you're getting a lot of copycats. And not copycats, the wrong word. You're watching a lot of new companies, very, very interesting collections of people who are taking this on. Now, I rarely would put a slide this big with that much text so that you can read it, and I won't read the whole thing. But this is a new company called Asana. It's been founded by Mark Andreessen, who is the founder of Netscape and also the co-chair of Ning. It's also the co-founder of Facebook, is one of the drivers behind it. Benchmark Capital just gave it $9 million in startup money. They essentially are trying to also build a business app for kind of a business version of Wave. Everybody's trying to figure out how do you get groups of people working together effectively. It's fundamentally a human endeavor, but the state of the art falls short of real efficiency. That problem is what everyone's throwing themselves at, and we're making big strides. And so that is going to start playing out in your kind of realm in the next couple years to 5 years here, because this is a space that's going to get a lot richer and a lot more potential for doing the kind of stuff you guys do, which is not just, hey, this is a great video, you know, I like it, thumbs up, but it's going to be like, here's a complicated problem. I need 50 people around the world to solve that problem. We got 2 weeks to do it. How do we do it? Boom. Now that's what's going to happen. That is what my company, I've been working on this for 18 months. My company is essentially, the way I think of it, is a new way to solve big problems fast. And I wouldn't normally lay this out in the talk, but I think it's applicable to you guys, so I just want to at least show you some of the thinking we've been doing on this, because I think it's applicable to your field. Not literally my company, but this kind of thinking I think you're going to want to start thinking about. Basically, and the way to kind of think about it here is, there's 2 fundamental breakthroughs we have to figure out in terms of problem solving. And then you as consultants have to figure this out. Is the current way that people do decisions is there's a few decisions in the hands of a few and a small number of experts or consultants, and you guys are in that kind of crew. But what happens is there is a lot of potential to get a lot more not just feedback, but fundamental input and involvement of all kinds of different people. And depending on the company, depending on the project, it could be stakeholders, it could be employees, it could be people outside experts, all kinds of stuff, people all over the world. So the question is, how do you get those folks involved? Now, the other thing that you have to figure out is you have to figure out there's 2 worlds of collaboration. One is physical and one is collaborative. And they've worked totally separately up until now. And so what you've got is some things like this gathering. You're bonding, you're connecting, you're emotionally connecting, you're networking. There's stuff that you're never going to replicate online. On the other hand, there's stuff online that you can't do here. Like we can't have 20,000 people in this room, right? So you're starting to figure out both are needed for solving problems. How do you connect the 2? Now the way to connect the 2, this is a good example. This is an example I'm saying. So for example, a lot of companies, you have your physical gatherings of senior leaders, but you have to figure out how would you through online get the whole company involved? Because there's a lot of stuff. Yeah, you need the perspective of leadership, but you need that on-the-ground feeling. You need the kind of facing the client kind of input that you're not able to get right now. So one of the ways you got to start thinking is cheap video. I mentioned how cheap video is getting. You've got to start figuring, how do we start bridging those 2 worlds? How do you start connecting what happens in a group like this, face-to-face, so people can build on it online? And ultimately, that's something that we're working on in our company. There's also, this is a way that once you get video from this kind of gathering, you can actually expose it, not just to employees, but to a much wider audiences, including the public. There's a way to kind of connect that physical to the virtual. And then once in the virtual, though, and this is, again, us using this Google Wave, you got to start being able to work on it. Not just say, oh, that was a cool talk by the CEO, but like, I got a better idea. I could evolve that. I could build on that. Here's my idea. And other people say, you know what? Not bad, but I could even do better than that. So essentially what we're working on is how do you combine these 3 things? And it's not just us. A lot of companies now are trying to figure out, how do you take this next level of collaboration? How do you link the online and offline world? Because essentially, there's going to be in the future a way that you're going to weave problem solving from face-to-face to online, to face-to-face to online, to face-to-face to online, to get much more sophisticated outcomes involving a lot more people. This world we know, the bottom row, conferences and how you drive that, basically design meetings. The top one we haven't really integrated into serious decision making and problem solving. That space is going to change a lot in the next 2 to 5 years. And so you got to figure out how do you integrate the two and make it so you got a much more powerful outcome in the end. Now, I'm at the end of my time here, so I'm just going to get back to the final little point here. What I started at the beginning is the world is facing a lot of big 21st century challenges. But all the companies within that, and all the communities within that, and all the nations within that are also facing these kind of questions too. And so what we've basically got are these hugely difficult problems that we haven't figured out before, including some that we've experienced now for a decade but haven't figured out really how to protect against. Some are coming that people aren't really wrapping their heads around, but believe me, this is going to be one we could go a whole nother little track on this that is essentially going to be around the corner soon. The world, as I mentioned, has got a lot of problems, and the units within that world are going to be struggling with their versions of these problems for the next 10, 20 years. Now, we are fully capable of making this transition from that old 20th century world to our much more interconnected, high-tech 21st century world. And I'm totally confident that we have all the technology to do this. We have all the human resources. The world has never had so many college-educated, PhD-level folks, people with all this experience. We've got more entrepreneurial energy. We have more powerful tools than any previous generation of this country or the world has ever seen before. And so we are fully capable of making this transition to this 21st century system, this kind of, I would say, ultimately clean energy system, the sustainable system, the one that's going to work for the long haul through the entire 21st century. We can do this, but it is going to be a very difficult slog. And I would tell you, it's going to start with everybody in this room, all of you. It's going to take all of us, and we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and get to work soon. So thank you.